Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. yet again. And we've got, as usual, we've got a great guest for you today, more like a friend of the show, Tony Shaffer, who is a retired lieutenant colonel, combat veteran, and host of the podcast, The Hard Truth, and then author of, don't you have a new book out, don't you? Am I thinking correctly?
No, nothing new. Just Operation Dark Heart and
That's right. Yeah, the big one there before, but now this new show where you look super cool, and I wish I could look as cool as you. But that's a separate issue, which I've got to work out with my therapist. But anyway, glad to have you back on the show, Tony.
Danny, it's cigars and pull-ups. That's how I do it. So combination.
Yeah, I mean that's a good regimen. I think I should follow that. But so we're here today. We're gonna talk about a situation that a lot of people don't want to talk about in the United States today. Especially, they like to keep focus right now on this horrible war in Israel and Hamas, which I'm sure that you and I are going to talk about in subsequent episodes here. But today we're going to talk about what's the back burner, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. And that's not going as well as some of our senior leaders talked about. In fact, in recent news here, there's been lots of problems with reports of extremely high rates of casualties on the Ukraine side, much more than what's been admitted to. Lots of dispute internally between Zelensky and his commander-in-chief Zaluzhny, problems with trying to recruit people, and the bottom line, no progress on the battlefield. How do you see this thing as of now after this summer offensive and before we get into the winter?
Well, and there's a really bad winter storm over there right now, which is really mucking things up as well. So let's start with so much there to jump into. It's like a smorgasbord of propaganda to sort through. So let's start with, I guess, the issue relating to Zaluzhny and Zelensky. So there's a lot of reports right now, Danny, I think all credible, that there's an immense power struggle going on for the direction of the strategy and of how to defeat Russia and Ukraine. Well, the bottom line is there's no strategy. And I think this is what's plagued them from day one. And I'm going to say something here that may upset, I don't think it'll upset your audience. I think it'll upset the mainstream media folks. General Omar Bradley once said, professionals focus on logistics, amateurs focus on strategy. And this is true by the fact that you can be the bravest soldier on the battlefield, but unless you have bullets to go with that bravery, it's not going to work. And what happened with Ukraine, while they had some of the bullets, they didn't have the correct combination of bravery, bullets, and essentially what I would say competent military leadership. We're going to get into that a little bit later, because a certain guy named Petraeus, I think, was one of their senior advisors. I think he's been overrated and under criticized, if you will. But we'll go through that. So what I'm trying to say here is that the very things that plagued the Nazi Germans, I just said it, regarding how they sustained themselves against the Soviets, are the same set of issues the Ukrainians had to face regarding the current Russian onslaught. There are, history does not repeat itself, but it likes to rhyme. And I think there's a lot of rhyme here, because ultimately the Ukrainians chose to employ tactical maneuver in such a way that they never were able to lay a glove on the Russians. They gave the Russians time to establish layers of defense. I mean, layers, Danny. It's like
miles and miles of layers.
Miles. Like, and then they chose to do something. The Germans ended up losing pretty much the effect is they had no aviation.
Yeah.
Over World War II, during 42, 43, 44, especially into 44, the Soviets dominated the airspace, and Nazi Germany had pretty much nothing left, especially regarding logistics. So everything, again, there's no direct analogy here. I can't do a one-for-one, but I'm telling you there are themes which relate to how the Soviets were able to overwhelm and defeat the offensive power, not defeat the German army. I'm not getting there yet, but defeat the offensive power of the Nazi army. And then from 43 onward, 44, 45, it was just a wash.
And Tony, similar in the Western Front, especially following D-Day in June 1944,
Right.
the lack of
Aviation
air power meant that their armored forces could only move during the nighttime or in bad weather, and without good air defenses or their own air power. I mean, the end was doomed, no matter how much more they fought. I think that we're in a similar situation.
Yeah, and then fast forward to the current tactics of the Russians. They've now mastered drone. What do you call drone use? It's like a drone, it's like aviation's aviation, but they have now figured out how to adapt this new technology called drones, and they're using it very effectively at every aspect. So the Russians really were behind on that at the beginning of the war.
Yeah,
now
definitely.
they're masters of it. They figured it out. So like you said, Danny, if your adversary is only able to kind of move at night, not well, they are limited regarding surveillance capabilities. And then now there's something called drones, which did not exist during World War II, which is a new technology that pretty much was introduced into the battle space since I remember getting a briefing as a very young second lieutenant in 1983 on the coming of drones and remote piloted vehicles.
Yeah.
So that trend started in the early 80s, and here it is, being fully implemented. The Ukrainians were defeated on all fronts before they ended up on the battlefield, Danny. It's like nothing that was planned, orchestrated, or strategized was able to create critical mass for the Ukrainians to create conditions for victory. And yet somehow because we recognize this, we've evaluated this. I'm sure your audience knows, you've been out there talking about this. Doug McGregor's been out there talking about this. I've been out there talking about this. The numbers don't add up. You cannot change the fundamental math of defeat. You can't do it. It's not possible. It's like you can't. It's like building the pyramids, Danny. You can't just decide I'm going to ignore algebra for today and not worry about these blocks. And we're just going to take it on faith that the pyramid's going to support it. So, it doesn't work. It doesn't.
Yeah. I think that your comment there at the beginning is so appropriate and directly related here, that wars are won by logistics, not even by great strategy. I mean, you got to have both, but if you don't have logistics, strategy won't do you any good. And this issue with drones is a big issue because Ukraine has drones. They have some, but the amount that the Russians are making and building and getting from other sources is dwarfing them. Plus their technological advancement with EW that's actually minimizing the capacity of the Ukrainian arsenal. They just can't match it. So the math just won't work, no matter how brave the soldiers are, and they are brave.
Another lesson from history, and I'm going way back, and there's a reason why I'm doing this. Just hang along for a second. During the Civil War, the United States Army, U.S. Army, adopted something called the Anaconda Strategy. You can Google it. Your audience can Google it. Basically, Lincoln and the generals figured out, Secretary Stanton figured out that we're going to have to squeeze the South. We're going to have to put them into essentially a restraint. And they did that by cutting off supplies. Obviously, the whole thing with cutting off their sea lanes, essentially a blockade. And then more importantly, outproducing them. Those who are, I'm a student of the Civil War. I've learned a lot about how Grant, especially at the end, the battle of the outbreak down in Fort Lee. By the way, my last assignment was at Fort Lee, and we were there on the battlefield as part of the 94th Division, which is one of Patton's divisions. Speaking of multiple parallels, so the fact is this: that in that Civil War between the South and North, between the United States Army and the Confederate forces, the United States Army was able to outproduce and use logistics far more readily and have far more resources than the South did. The bravery of the Southern soldier mattered not in the end. And I know there was immense bravery. There's a battle right now where I live in North and here at Edenton, a Civil War statue devoted to the memory of the fallen soldiers of the South. God bless them. They fought and died valiantly. but they fought and died. And that's my point, is that the logistics of the Union Army outperformed and outproduced and overwhelmed the South by an order of magnitude, Danny, an order of magnitude.
Right. And the other parallel, I think, is that the end was clear more than a year before the end of it, but no one could come to that conclusion. So how many more thousands of men died pointlessly that didn't change the outcome? And I think we're in that same spot right now.
Exactly. So we're in that spot. And again, and the reason I use the Civil War analogy here is because many people, to include me, see the dust up between the Russians and Ukrainians as a civil war. Those countries have been locked at the hip for hundreds of years. So I don't believe for a minute that, first off, we should have ever engaged in a civil dispute between essentially what I believe to be regional powers. I know this is a controversial position to have, but that's what I believe. I think we should have been helpful to both sides, try to find a way to essentially negotiate and support getting them through to basically not have conflict. And when that failed, to jump in and only be helpful to create space for negotiations, not for engagement regarding military operations. And here we are. We spent billions of dollars, $113+ billion. We got nothing out of it, nor will we. And you have a whole generation of men, mostly Ukrainians, who have died. And to what benefit and to what end?
Right. And you know, Tony, it's about to get worse. Because they've been running out of men, they're now expanding their mobilization population down to 18-year-olds.
Right.
They're bringing people who even aren't fit for service because they just don't have the bodies. And instead of recognizing the reality, they're just digging deeper into what they're going to desperately need for the future to rebuild Ukraine once this is over. And it's just a senseless self-slaughter.
I think there's another nation that went through this, 1944, 45, Germany. They started going and digging deep into underage children and old men to try to stop the onslaught of the Russians. Again, history does not repeat itself, but it certainly likes to rhyme, and this is another rhyme. So I know we're all over the map today a little bit, at least I am, but I'm trying to basically pull valid parallels out of history and apply them to this. And maybe this will be educational to our Army generals, Danny, because I don't just come to conclusions based on tea leaves. Being an intelligence officer and everything, I don't just I don't call the psychic hotline and ask for help like some generals I know. Just saying, nothing wrong with that, I guess, if you've got the budget to do the 800 numbers, never 900 numbers, but But I'm just saying that I do actually sit down and look rationally at history, look at how certain events played out, and then how to apply those to current circumstance, which apparently this methodology baffles our generals, apparently.
And Tony, that's kind of really the core of really what I wanted to say in this episode and why I wanted to have it. And that is the implications. We're talking so far about the implications for Ukraine and for what that's going to look like going forward and the potential for them to actually lose the war, not just have a stalemate. Right. But here's the bigger issue to me, to the American people. There is something worse at play that could portend problem for us in the future. And that is how some of our senior leaders are viewing this. Yeah. Now, we just talked about these are fundamentals. These are historical analogies. And the reason why the analogies matter is because the human element is almost never changed in war. And the things that affect it, the logistics, all those things, they just have predictable influences on that.
Yep.
But we have some of our senior leaders, and I'm talking about the most famous senior leaders who are on television all the time, coming to a rather different conclusions. And I want to show a couple of different clips of two different generals. Then I want your observations on some of those and some of the concerns that will have for America going forward. The first is Brother Ben Hodges. He was a retired 3-star general who was the commander of U.S. Army forces in Europe. And I'm talking, that's a big position. And you would expect him to not only know everything we've been talking about, but to be a master at it, because he should have all the experience, all the knowledge, and definitely the personal, command experience. That's what we would expect. But instead, we get something different. Now, here he is at the first of the year in January of this year, talking about the looming Ukrainian offensive that was expected to come. And here's what he said about what he expected to happen.
Are there bright lights on the horizon for Ukraine, that there could be some kind of decisive victory? Or is it really a prospect of many, many months, if not years, of kind of attrition and stalemate?
So I believe that Ukraine is going to liberate Crimea by the end of August, so the end of this summer. And I say that because we know that from history that war is a test of will and it's a test of logistics.
Apparently, he failed his test.
He did, but it gets worse. So heading into in January, he thought, yeah, we're gonna win. They're gonna take back Crimea, which was an unbelievable claim at that point in the war. But then here's what he said after the offensive in August, I believe it was, after the offensive didn't have that success. Now he changes his story a little.
The counteroffensive obviously is not going as quickly or smoothly as anybody had hoped, but that's not the metric. The metric is, will it accomplish what is required to help Ukraine liberate Crimea and achieve victory in this war? It's frustrating, to say the least, when I hear the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or other American officials bemoan that the counteroffensive is not going so well, or that it's really hard, when in fact we are not providing some of the critical capabilities that Ukraine needs.
So Tony, it's not really that we didn't do a good job planning or that we had unrealistic beliefs. It's our fault for not giving them more stuff, because stuff wins the war. Oh, wait a minute. That's actually not how it's worked out, but that's how he's blaming. So he's frustrated with some generals. And look, we have had a lot of issues with the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Milley, many times. But on this one, he was right, and we said so. There was reasons why he was saying that this thing's not going very well. This guy is frustrated, and now it's our fault because we didn't give him issues. And just for a little context, he said we didn't give him enough ATACMs and we didn't give him the F-16s early enough. And if we had only done those two things, we'd be in Crimea today.
Yeah, no, it's not true. And this is leadership by mythical creatures. It's like
mythical creatures.
Yeah, it's like if you just had enough, if we had more unicorns, Danny, if we just had unicorns, we could have had them do magical things on the battlefield. If we just had rainbows, we could have put rainbows all over, and everybody would have been just so struck by watching them. That's the kind of thing. It's magical thinking, Danny. It doesn't work. It's never worked. So let's break this down. By the way, I used to teach classes at the U.S. Army War College. So I'm going to give you all, I'm going to give your audience a lesson on what I did at the War College. And apparently Hodges didn't attend my class. Just saying. Maybe he should have. He would have benefited.
Now there's an if only he had, things might be different. Anyway, Professor, continue on, please.
Oh, here we go. There's two words he used which are very deadly and dangerous to the military mind in any respect. Hope. Never use hope in context of military strategy, ever. First rule, General. Come on. What the hell? Hope? Dude. All right. Second, metric. Oh my God. One of the things I would rail against, and I still do every chance, today's modern military, Danny, you saw it. We want to categorize things and manage things by really nice check marks. We want to do check marks. We don't want to do, it's like in college. You remember when college, everybody wanted to do multiple and like the multiple choice. We don't want to do the essay. I always like doing the essay because it gives you ability to explain yourself.
And think, by the way, you have to be able to think on those, but I digress.
That's right. And that's what's lacking. So they want to do multiple choice. So all these generals want multiple choice. They don't want to actually think. And so metrics is how they've established a system of phony baloney accountability. Remember the movie Blazing Saddles? Phony baloney jobs. Governor Petraeus. Not that I'm saying our generals are like Governor Petraeus. Maybe a little bit, but not all. But in the context of this conversation, they've established something called measures of effectiveness, MOE. They've now put these metrics in place so that you can do a dozen different things based on an artificial standard. Oh, you did you polish your boots, Danny? You did. Oh, it's a check mark. Did you go and not eat too much gravy and grits at the chow hall? You didn't. That's good. That's another check. Good but point. Did you actually kill the bad guys and win the war? No. But we're not measuring against that. We're not measuring against performance. We're not measuring against measures of performance.
That is such an important point. Yeah.
So I used to teach this, and maybe that's why I'm not invited back to teach anymore, just saying. But anyway, because my friends, my former shout out to the commandants who support me, Tony Kukolo and Colonel and General Kim. Love them to death. I'm not mad mouthing them because they actually had me up there doing stuff. I'm saying that the Army does not like the idea of being told that the standards they've established, measures of performance, does not reflect well on their ability to win wars. And Hodges is a victim of that, and Petraeus is a victim of that. They've established this alternate universe where, as long as they establish, as I'm the general, I once told Tony Zinni to his face that generals often equate rank to wisdom, and it's not true.
And people on the television do too. And I, to a large extent, I don't blame them, because they see a guy who's got 4 stars on his chest. Well, of course you can't get to be a CEO or the head of some corporation unless you've gone through the steps and excelled at each step. That's the belief. Only the best and the brightest get brought up, so they must be, ergo what they say, because I don't know, I didn't serve, so they would say he did, so he must be great. But unfortunately, the common sense of looking, here's the big problem, and the reason why, Tony, we have shown what we did, we're about to show something on Petraeus, is because we need to say, here's what they said, here's what happened or didn't happen. People need to be held accountable and understand that rank doesn't equal wisdom. Right.
So on that point, I just want to basically put the exclamation point on my point. The military leaders of today worship mediocrity. That's what the standard is. It's being mediocre. And the generals who currently serve, for the most part, and I include Mark Milley, Hodges, Petraeus, have become politicians in uniform. They're not generals. As a real general has to have the courage of their conviction to say what they truly believe is good military strategy and advice. I know a few of those generals. They're few and far between, because so much has been placed on a military education. To your point, Danny, all these people go through all the academies and they get all the different diplomas, and they must be smart. They attended academic institutions which gave them pieces of paper. Okay. If you think that's wisdom, then that's fine, but it's not. And then,
and honestly, Tony, just what I'm about to show is going to just demonstrate that graphically. Now, I'm going to show again 2 clips from Petraeus, both before the counteroffensive began in the summer and what he said toward the end of it. But I want to make clear, this is not just picking on these 2 guys. There are a bunch more we could have picked in there. This is consistent. But here's the first one from Petraeus right before the offensive began in May of this year.
General Petraeus is very interesting because, A, he's a former military commander, so he knows about offences, but also he's plugged in here. He saw President Zelensky yesterday. And in my interview, what struck me was just his sheer confidence about not just the coming Ukrainian offensive, but also his very bleak assessment of Russia's fighting capability. This is just a flavour of what he told me.
The Russian winter offensive has failed to achieve its objectives. Yes, it took one piece of that, Bakhmut, but as the Ukrainian leaders have described to us over the last several days, that was an incredible mousetrap for the Russians. And by the Russians' own admissions, Prigozhin and others, they lost tens of thousands of soldiers, many more that were wounded there, and they failed to achieve the greater objectives of retaking all of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts. I believe that we'll see for the first time in this war on either side the achievement of true combined arms effects. In other words, the results of tanks protected by infantry against anti-tank guided missiles, artillery and mortars keeping the enemy's heads down, engineers reducing the obstacles, breaching these fortifications that the Russians have established, air defense keeping the Russians off the Ukrainians, electronic warfare jamming the Russians' already inadequate command and control facilities, and all orchestrated by very, very good Ukrainian command and control, and also using drones out over the Russians to attack them in depth with the precision munitions that the U.S. and U.K. and others have provided. And this, I think, is going to break the front lines. And noting that on the Russian side, this is a force that has been battered, that many of these units have been in constant combat for well over a year. They're not pulling units offline and reconstituting them. In other words, replacing the losses, the people, the equipment, and retraining them. They're just adding people to the front lines. That's not the way you produce a cohesive, coherent, well-disciplined organization. And I think, therefore, that's why they're going to crack, crumble, and perhaps actually collapse.
Okay, now before I show you the second clip, I want to point out a couple of things he said there because it's important. He went in great detail about how Ukraine was prepared to do combined arms offensives, how they had gone to NATO training sites, and that he also specifically talked about how hard it would be to go through the Russian defensive belts and how they had engineering support, drone support, and all this kind of stuff. So he talked about that they were prepared for all these things, but then after it didn't work out so well, he comes back and says this.
Military voices in the United States keep poking holes in Kyiv's allocation of resources, troops, and combat operations. I'm joined now by the former CIA director, retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus, formerly head of U.S. Central Command. I don't know whether you heard the former defense minister, but he had some really interesting things to say about what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how it's actually going, by and large, according to plan, as much as a war can.
I did hear it. I thought it was a terrific interview, actually. I'd just add that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and that has been true in this case. Certainly, there were hopes that with Western tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and other systems that they might be able to mount combined arm operations that could penetrate the Russian defenses. But that was before we all learned about the depth of these defenses, about the sophistication of them. The Russians have not distinguished themselves in many respects over the last year and a half or so, but this defense in depth is quite formidable.
That's unbelievable, Tony, that he wants to sit there now on August 28th after on May 31st saying that they were prepared to go into Russian defenses. And he said, well, we didn't know how big the Russian defenses were. If you read the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they had graphic detail months in advance of just how elaborate the defense was. How can he say that and get by with it today?
So the Bakhmut engagement was a distraction, and I think the Russians played it brilliantly. Clearly, Prigozhin using all the force there in one spot, and then the Ukrainians continuing to pour all sorts of force in there. At the rest of the time, they're all just preparing all these defenses. Somehow, Petraeus missed that. It's like, what the hell? So,
he called it a mousetrap for the Russians.
Like, dude, no.
I think he's a little opposite of that.
What? He's like, General, what army did you serve in again? Just say, it's like, wow. It's like, and now he's trying to explain, oh, well, I really am not incompetent. I just misinterpreted things. Okay, it's kind of the same thing, but okay. So, and then some other words he used here, you know, the whole combined arms training. Danny, they did not do combined arms training. I know combined arms training. You know combined arms training. I don't know if you ever went to a Reforger. Reforgers are combined arms training.
I did all that.
Reforgers, that is the ultimate expression of our confidence and a capability with our allies. And I've been saying, if you want to get
by the way, real quick, Reforger, for those who may not know, was during the Cold War, we would send hundreds of thousands of troops over and literally maneuver across the European countryside like as if it were a real war. It was a big deal.
Oh, yeah. Return of forces to Germany. And I'm a big fan of that. I mean, boy, my first Reforger, I had to go undercover in 85 as a young college kid, lieutenant. That's a whole nother story we could get into someday. But
I'd like to hear it someday.
Yeah, but it was like, boy, to see that both as an individual in it and then to be a planner on it later, man, there's nothing better than that. That's combined arms. That's putting it all together, making it work. What they did, Danny, was a 21st century military planning tactic known as virtue signaling. What they did is they took all these Ukrainians, send them to every single country in NATO. It's like, oh, let's send some people to Portugal. They can play on the Portuguese Army's volleyball team and get some really good experience. And let's send some people to Finland and let's teach them how to use snowshoes. And then they put them all back together and they have the divergent skill sets, which don't actually add up. It's not like a puzzle. You've done like a tapestry of things all over the place that don't fit. So instead of having an interlocking puzzle, doing a Reforger where you bring people, you have people who are trained in different places all over the world. You put them together and you put it together so that puzzle pieces come together and they interlock and you can go do something with that. They didn't do that. They didn't do a Reforger model. They did this woke model where let's send people out and hope for the best. Hope. There's that word again.
Yes, again, yeah.
That's what they did. They didn't do combined arms. They did virtue signaling. And they thought that,
That's such a great point.
It is. What's what they did. It's obvious. And then, we didn't have aviation. Didn't you launch the attack anyway? What the hell is wrong with you? Seriously, they sent a whole generation. I'm sorry, this is a passion of mine, Danny. I'm getting a little bit, but they sent a whole generation of kids to their deaths over bad tactics, lacking logistics, and known flaws within their own strategy where they knew, oh, we don't have aviation, but we're going to do it anyway. What?
Yeah. That was one of the biggest things to me, is that there was so many things. Even Zelensky said that y'all would never do this. You would never attack without that. And we did. And yet you had the Petraeuses, you had the Hodges, you had Jack Keynes. All these guys said that it was going to succeed, and they should, all of them have known there was no rational chance to do it. And we've sent all these Ukrainian men to their deaths. And now then we see the result. You said the results should matter at the beginning of this. It does matter. And when you look at the map from 1 year ago and today, it's identical. There's almost no difference at all, except that the casualty count and the military graveyards are through the roof there. That's the tragedy of this.
Right.
And I fear much more is coming if we don't learn these lessons.
Death, destruction, and devastation that was unnecessary because they've gained nothing. There's a series. Have you seen a series called Blackadder?
I have not.
So Rowan Atkinson plays the Adder, and there's a scene where in World War I, they basically go through all the ages and all the British missteps. You know, the British, they're kind of cool people, except for the teeth, and they have this one episode. I'm going to get in trouble for that, I know. Anyway, they have this one episode where they're talking about the character being dead, getting killed on the battlefield, and they did this great offensive. And after the offensive, they have this big old room where they have a diorama of the battlefield, and they have this big old thing of grass in the center of the room. And so the general walks in and says, "Well, you know, he died valiantly for this terrain." And yes, sir, yes, he did. What is the scale of this map, sir? It's like 1 to 1. So all they got in this battle was literally a room full of dirt. That's the point. So that's what they got. The Ukrainians have gained nothing over the past year and made valiant effort. I'm not disputing the valiant fighting effort of the Ukrainian troops. I feel sorry for them because they were fed a load of nonsense, and our generals are responsible. They're responsible for lying to the American public about the prospects and convincing people to invest billions, Danny, of taxpayer dollars into something that was going to fail. And then worse, they advised the Ukrainian leadership to do this without knowing, as Zelensky said, you would never do this, and we would have never done it.
And here's the biggest issue, and we'll leave it here for today and pick it up on the next time we have you back on there. But these are the same kind of people who will be advising our current leadership and our current people on any potential American involvement in the future. And these are the same guys that might be making decisions for us. And that worries me a lot about what's going on. It also worries me a lot about the next phase of this war and how many more graveyards are going to have to be dug for this, and again, for no change. And ultimately, I think that it could actually collapse on the Ukrainian side just out of sheer exhaustion. But we'll pick that up on the next one because there is a lot more to discuss here. But we really appreciate you coming on, Tony. Thanks so much. Great ideas, and look forward to continue watching your show here, The Hard Truth. And thanks for coming on today, and we will pick it back up next time. That's all we have for you on Deep Dive today, and we will see you next time.